All right, hi everybody on Zoom in person. Just want to say again, thank you to everyone who's spoken already today. Thank you for everybody for attending so that we can collectively celebrate and uplift the life and legacy of Gloria Naylor. So I'm going to introduce our keynote lecture. All right. Although words cannot adequately express how honored I am to welcome our keynote speaker, Maxine Montgomery, to Lehigh University, I'll have to give it my best try. This semester, I've had the pleasure of reading and engaging with Dr. Montgomery's phenomenal work, which has helped me tremendously in contextualizing the conversations my classmates and I have been facilitating with our beloved Professor Suzanne Edwards in her seminar course aptly titled Gloria Naylor in the Archives. Reading Dr. Montgomery's scholarship alongside Gloria Naylor's novels has also inspired my own thinking on notions of Black women's geographies, archival hauntings, and apocalyptic visions of Afro-Caribbean futurity. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to introduce her to you all today. A professor of English at Florida State University, Maxine Montgomery earned her doctorate from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, specializing in diasporic studies, contemporary Black women's literature, and Black apocalyptic expressive cultures. Her work explores how Black creators situate themselves and their characters at the end of the world, employing Black feminisms, post-colonialism, and transnational discourses to make legible sites of resistance and insurgency in Black literary productions. Her work in these areas have been published in South Carolina Review, the Literary Griot, College Language Association Journal, Zora Neale Hurston Forum, Journal of Black Studies, Palimpsest, a journal on women, gender, and the Black International, and African American Review. Her newest release, she has published several books, two of which directly engage with Gloria Naylor's novels. And her newest release, The Post-Apocalyptic Black Female Imagination, invokes some of her earlier themes of catastrophe and resistance with a focus on today's social and ecological disasters to highlight how Black women across the diaspora engage with literature and visual media and reimagine Black futurity. Over the past few decades, Dr. Montgomery's scholarship on Gloria Naylor has afforded the oft-overlooked author and her work a level of true grace, care, and rigor. Though the two women eventually became friends later in life, Dr. Montgomery's early reviews of Naylor's novels praised the author for her then evolving literary sensibility and clarity of vision. Quote, "In her efforts to define herself as a writer," she writes in a 1993 review of Bailey's Cafe, "Naylor dares to engage important social, political, and cultural issues affecting women worldwide, and therefore rescues the stories of women from silence and oblivion. At a time when women across the globe are experiencing unprecedented oppression, Naylor's voice is a clarion one that demands to be heard." End quote. How relevant. Since then, Dr. Montgomery has remained nuanced and generous in her engagement with Naylor's work, even in instances where she herself has acknowledged Naylor's shortcomings. To wit, although she admits Men of Brewster Place lacks the prosaic verve of Naylor's previous work, we can talk about that later, Dr. Montgomery asserts that nevertheless, the novel, quote, "offers a much-needed glimpse into the inner life of Black men from a Black woman's perspective, and thus represents an important contribution to contemporary African American letters," end quote. With her books, Dr. Montgomery has continuously elevated Naylor's work from obscurity by giving serious theoretical attention to Naylor's engagement with gender, space, and identity. In her 1996 study, The Apocalypse in African American Fiction, Dr. Montgomery describes The Women of Brewster Place as a novel that, quote, "speaks of the triumph of the human spirit over adversity," and the role that socio-political events play in helping to forge the collective consciousness necessary for positive change, end quote. She envisions Naylor's characters as enacting an apocalypse of their own doing through the dismantling of the titular street's dead-end brick wall, as well as the, quote, "restrictions of the amorphous white male political system responsible for Brewster's creation," end quote. Her more recent writing has delved deeper into Naylor's engagement with gender, geography, and space, such as her 2007 chapter entitled Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places, Same-Sex Relations in the Fiction of Gloria Naylor, wherein Dr. Montgomery complicates what a racial safe space looks like for the queer Black men and women of Naylor's oeuvre as they redefine kinship bonds and self-conception within socially restrictive environments and communities. In 2010, she published The Fiction of Gloria Naylor, Houses and Spaces of Resistance, a collection of essays highlighting how Naylor's tetralogy redefines notions of home and space in order to, quote, disclose the innumerable ways that individuals negotiate the restrictive places in which they find themselves, thereby wresting supremacy from those in positions of power, end quote. Again, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Montgomery as she presents her lecture tonight for the symposium entitled History is a Written Photograph, Gloria Naylor, Archival Moments, and Black Women's Literary Legacies. As a foremost scholar of Gloria Naylor's work, she is a testament to the legacy of Naylor's archive, a bastion of Black feminist archival praxis, and a force to be reckoned with. To witness her speak in the flesh is an honor that none of us here today should take for granted. So please join me in welcoming the great Dr. Maxine Montgomery.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I hope I can live up to the hype. And thanks to the audience as well. Thanks to each of you for being here this evening. And I want to acknowledge not only those of you who are present, but those of you who are joining in with us on a virtual basis. I am honored to be here at Lehigh University amidst such a stellar group of archivists, librarians, literary scholars, and performing artists as well. This is my first time traveling here to the Lehigh Valley, but I can assure you it will not be my last visit. And it's wonderful being here and being immersed in all things Gloria Naylor. This is an especially gratifying experience for me on many levels. I want to begin by introducing or setting up my remarks. Then I want to offer a brief historiography of archivism in relation to Black female subjects. Finally, I would like to pivot to an interrogation of Lyndon Hills and Mama Day. Together, those two novels foreground the persistence and potential of Black women's archives for literary criticism and the need for an approach to the archives resonant with knowledge production emanating from a folk sensibility. As Coco hovers on the brink of death, Mama Day searches for the remedy to undo the witchery of neo-colonial influences responsible for the young woman's illness. A series of rituals culminating with George's involvement in Coco's unconventional cure bring about the young woman's recovery, but only after the elder wise woman, Mama Day, uncovers an aging bill of sale detailing Bascom Wade's purchase of island foremother Sapphira. Deciphering the 19th century document proves daunting as water damage effaces the words inscribed on the certificate. Yet it is Mama Day's careful search for this obscure genealogical record, alongside the reader's work in decoding the cryptic language on the faded bill of sale, that have implications for a reappraisal of Naylor's creative output against the backdrop of source documentation and the rich possibilities of the archives and a review of the author's canon. My talk, as Isaiah points out, is entitled History is a Written Photograph, Gloria Naylor, Archival Moments, and Black Women's Literary Legacies. Literary representations of archival moments or symbolic reenactments of encounters with primary source material are interwoven throughout Naylor's multiple text fictional canon. Beginning in earnest with Lyndon Hills, Naylor explores the ways in which archival material discloses an invisible history announcing the achievements of Black women. Willa Prescott Need's ascent from the basement is framed within her discovery of documents authored by successive generations of foremothers. Seeing herself imaged in a cookpot prompts Willa's realization of a gendered presence within and apart from a meta-history of patriarchal authority and capitalist domination. Only then does the housewife climb the stairway back to the kitchen in a gesture leading to the destruction of the Need mansion, locus for a centuries-old oppression of Black women. A concern with historical records and their insinuation for 19th and 20th century family and social dynamics continues with Mama Day, Naylor's critically most acclaimed novel, and certainly my most favorite novel as well. Ever conscious of the close relationship between her own archival work and her creative endeavors, Naylor includes a map, genealogy, and bill of sale in dramatizing the transgenerational saga engulfing Willow Springs residents before introducing the reader to Rima's boy, Dr. Buzzard, Abigail, Junior Lee, or Miss Ruby. George Andrews' inability to locate the remote island using his commercialized map, along with Rima's boy's misguided attempts to place Willow Springs on the map, speak not only of the failure of customary ethnographic methodologies in decoding the island's vibrant culture. Encounters with various papers also underscore the persistence of source documentation over time, the manner in which records from the past intrude upon the present, often in unexpected ways, interrupting an otherwise unbroken temporality by reminding us of the potential of the archives for interrogating women's narrative art. The discovery or rediscovery of papers, letters, diary entries, notes, property records, or photographs offers a clue to understanding Naylor's archival awareness, her systematic engagement with the creative process, and the temporal stakes involved in a scholarly approach to the archives. Jean-Christophe Cloutier's groundbreaking investigation of the life cycles of African American literature sheds much needed critical light on the role of the archives and special collections in texts by Black authors. Naylor demonstrates the viability of the archives, not just in terms of their shadow potential, but also with race, class, gender, and sexualities as interlocking influences in how we assess this material in relation to Black women's literary and cultural production. I had the privilege of interviewing Naylor nearly 2 decades ago at her Park Slope residence. At the time, I was at work on 2 projects, Conversations with Gloria Naylor and the fiction of Gloria Naylor, Houses and Spaces of Resistance. Naylor was a gracious hostess as she invited me into her expansive, multi-story home. Being there was much like visiting a museum featuring the world-class African art and artifacts she collected during her international travels. And let me interject that at this moment that I took a break earlier today and went up to the 4th floor of, I think it's McGinnis Hall, and I saw 2 masks that I remember seeing in her house. And that was a very moving experience, both my visit to Naylor's home and my seeing those masks again on this campus. Naylor and I talked for almost 3 hours about a range of concerns, from her candid observations on the attack on the World Trade Center to the writer's block she faced while exploring the life of Mama Day Sapphira Wade. Nearly a third of the way into the interview, I asked Naylor to respond to criticism surrounding male representation in her debut work of fiction, The Women of Brewster Place. She bristled, then replied in a rather defensive manner, "Well, Maxine, my energies were spent creating a woman-centered universe. Male characters in The Women of Brewster Place had walk-on parts." Our relationship evolved into a collegial friendship since that initial interview. Several years passed before I saw Naylor again. She accepted my invitation to visit Florida State University to read from the critically understudied fictionalized memoir 1996, published by Third World Press. We remain in contact through email and telephone conversations, punctuated by an occasional meetup at scholarly conferences. Throughout her lengthy and auspicious literary career, issues of race, class, gender, and sexual difference, and their implications for Black women's intersectional identities remained at the forefront of her creative endeavors. Source material documenting the evolution of her career as a writer, editor, playwright, production company director, and public intellectual, along with the social and cultural realities she confronted, prompt a rethinking of the connection between her unpublished papers and the artistic output issuing from the over 47 linear feet of archival material housed here at Lehigh University. Naylor reminds us of the viability of those records in conceptualizing Black feminist epistemologies, as well as the need to preserve Black women's source material, with implications for outlining new lines of scholarly inquiry for archival methodology and literary criticism. Curating Naylor's papers raises questions that archivists, scholars, teachers, research librarians, and the general public must confront. What are the good practices, not best practices? I was corrected earlier today by one of the panelists who suggested the use of the term good practices rather than best. What are the good practices for locating, processing, and allowing broad access to Black women's archival material? To what extent is it possible to frame an interdisciplinary methodology in critiquing the power dynamics surrounding Black women's exclusion from formal archival spaces? How do 21st century scholars liberate the archival encounter from its fixed, overdetermined construction as a strictly academic undertaking? And equally as important, what are the challenges and possibilities of Black women's invisibility or misrepresentation within the archives in relation to contemporary literary criticism? The remedy for Coco's unnamed ailment lies in knowledge production predating the young woman's storied relationship with George Andrews, the Atlanta Business School laying claim to her educational training, and an urbanized New York. Mama Day has to reach back into the past, into a largely unscripted history involving chattel slavery, fraught cultured, gendered, and sexual relations, and an Africanist spirituality. In their suggestions for how we view history and historical papers in relation to narrative and text, the elder wise woman's visits to the other place are more than just a journey to the 19th century Wade mansion. They are a passage to a symbolic realm that is neither linguistically coded nor geographically demarcated, an uncharted space of intervention with implications for naming innovative approaches to archival studies, contemporary literary criticism, and the intersection between the two disciplines. The period following the late 1960s witnessed a concern with recovering a documentable past among contemporary African American narrative artists. largely in response to waves of social and political activism from the modern civil rights movement, the Black Revolution, and the feminist movement. The urge to cast off the shackles of domination from a conservative literary and political establishment gave rise to a flowering of expressivity on the part of Black writers who mined the past as an inspirational resource in addressing present-day concerns. Keith Byerman traces this blossoming of interest in African American history as a topic of significant national conversation to the demands of activists in the late 1960s for the recovery of what had been lost or deliberately suppressed. Although there has been an interest in historical narrative as long as Blacks have been writing fiction, Byerman notes, the present generation of fiction writers is the first to make a reinscription of the past, the dominant mode. Foremost among the precipitating influences governing a narrative interest in a recovered history and its indications for Black writing, political ideology, and social interactions is the Black feminist movement, with sustained interest in identifying and reclaiming precursor authors and texts. Alice Walker's recovery work involving Zora Neale Hurston, whose inventive genius continues to inspire folklorists, anthropologists, and creative artists, marks the beginning of formal efforts to recuperate a gendered literary and cultural heritage. Walker's landmark essay, Looking for Zora, discloses the literary detective work central to an investigation of Black women's archival production and special collections. Searching for Hurston's unmarked gravesite prompted Walker to rely upon pictures, news clippings, and a map, records that allowed Walker to reconstruct Hurston's life and the circumstances surrounding the foremother's death in a Fort Pierce nursing home. Ultimately, oral lore from the locals who knew Hurston proved helpful, including the source documentation Walker used during her pilgrimage to South Florida, a journey assuming sacred associations in the recovery work surrounding Black women's contributions to literature, history, and culture. Deborah Gray White set the stage for such recovery work by adopting a historiographic approach and announcing a concern with a dearth of archival material by and about Black women. For Gray White, national repositories of Black female historical evidence in the form of interviews and oral narratives underscore a troubling invisibility of Black women within formal or academic archival spaces. Her contribution to an understanding of a Black female archival praxis surrounds insights into the challenges associated with identifying, collecting, and allowing comprehensive access to Black women's documents. The tendency to privilege the written word and printed text rather than oral lore, issues of the Black woman's adversarial relation to institutional spaces, the subsuming of Black women's historical documents within archival material on whites or males, inadequate indexing practices, a lack of sensitivity to Black women's unique history, and problems with accessibility through in-person exchanges or interlibrary loan present themselves as barriers to curating Black women's archival production. Although some holdings have gone unprocessed, repositories at the Library of Congress, Howard University's Moreland Spingard Research Center, along with the Black Women in the Middle West Project, address the invisibility of Black women in the archives in ways that signal the possibilities for future archivism in the collection of historical documentation by and about Black female subjects. Efforts on the part of scholars, archivists, and research librarians in the collection of published and unpublished material by and about Black women have yielded modest progress in the years following the publication of Gray White's pioneering 1987 essay. Still, much work remains in the recovery initiatives essential to the assemblage of Black women's historical record and the dissemination of that body of evidence for wide-ranging public access. With the notable exceptions of a select group of authors, Black women are still less likely to have their works curated as part of a collection, despite literary output, commercial success, or critical acclaim. Hurston's papers are included as part of collections at the George A. Smathers Library at the University of Florida, Tulane's Amistad Research Center, Yale's Beinecke Library, and the Library of Congress, home to sketches, plays, and the unpublished typescript of the controversial Mule Bone, a comedy of Negro life. This collection has been digitized and is now available online as well as in its original paper format. But Hurston's papers still don't have a comprehensive archive like F. Scott Fitzgerald's have at Princeton University or Ernest Hemingway's at the John F. Kennedy Library and Museum in Boston. The literary world is indebted to the recovery work of Carla Kaplan and the late Cheryl Wall for bringing Hurston's unpublished material to the attention of contemporary scholars, teachers, and the general public. Wall, who edited the Hurston Library of America edition, Zora Neale Hurston, Folklore, Memoirs, and Autobiographical Writing, said that the author's writings essentially had to be organized from scratch. At the time of Hurston's death, her papers were scattered around the country. Some materials were preserved, we now know, only when a passerby saw that they were being burned in the trash and removed them in time. Wall speculated that there is doubtless more material to be found. And she goes on to say, I am not sure how much, and no one can predict where. Although Wall pointed out that there is no archive for Jessie Fawcett or Nella Larson, she also mentioned that future scholars will not face the same challenges she encountered with Hurston's papers when searching for unpublished material by June Jordan, Toni Morrison, or Alice Walker. Toni Cade Bambara's collection is housed at Spelman College, as we heard earlier today, where she taught writing and African American studies courses. Audre Lorde's papers are also housed at Spelman. Ann Petrie's papers are located at Yale, the Schomburg Center, and Boston University's Howard Gottlieb Archival Research Center. Gwendolyn Brooks's papers are at the University of California, Berkeley's Bancroft Library. This collection includes the extensive manuscripts, correspondence, and working materials of award-winning American science fiction writer Octavia E. Butler as well. Ntozake Shange's papers are housed in Barnard's archives and special collections, and June Jordan's papers are housed at the Schlesinger Library's Radcliffe Institute. Alice Walker's papers are at the Library of Congress and Emory University. Phyllis Wheatley's chapbooks and first editions of poems on various subjects are housed as part of Emory's Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library, along with the papers of poet Lucille Clifton. And Princeton's Harvey Firestone's Memorial Library houses more than 200 linear feet of material documenting the life and work of Nobel and Pulitzer Prize-winning author Toni Morrison, whose debut work of fiction, The Bluest Eye, inspired Gloria Naylor's The Women of Brewster Place. The last 15 years have witnessed a blossoming of scholarship on Black women's archival production and the role of the archives in telling the untold stories of ordinary women. But Black women continue to face a conundrum surrounding a comparative lack of attention to primary source material. Ashley Farmer encapsulates the central inconsistency surrounding scholarly approaches to Black women's archival record when she asked, how should scholars address the paradox of simultaneously finding copious archival records on some Black women while also accounting for the deafening archival silence on others? Farmer signals a paradigmatic shift in Black women's archival studies as more Black women writers find their places in the archives and special collections, and scholars move from a consideration of issues surrounding Black women's exclusion from archival repositories to a concentration on historical omission as a locus for narrative invention. Instead of focusing on the absence of Black women in the archives, recent scholarship attends to power dynamics in the archive itself and the consequences of those dynamics in an interrogation of Black women's narrative art. Farmer draws upon the work of Marissa Fuentes, who encourages scholars to eke out the extinguished and invisible aspects of their lives by revisiting the known archive and reflecting more deeply on the power imbalances within it. Following Farmer's lead, Talitha Gloria deploys an innovative method of mining the invisible through interpretive strategies sensitive to a buried historiography as she attends to a history of Black female subjectivity. Saidiya Hartman remains at the forefront of 21st century archival thinkers as she excavates the buried histories undergirding successive generations of women. Hartman's contribution to an archival methodology responsive to Black women's source material relates to critical fabulation, a strategy involving how a researcher might use narrative to respond creatively to archival omissions, struggling both to tell an impossible story and to amplify the impossibility of its telling. Acknowledging the limits of archival production and the need to render a comprehensive portrait of Black women's lived experiences, Hartman intervenes into the silence surrounding Black women in the archives as a site for a reconstruction of past events. In other words, rather than seeking exclusively to uncover what is known, Hartman argues for an organizational approach to Black women's archival production that seeks to fathom what cannot be known in deference to a dynamic history receptive to disruptions, revisions, and shifts over time. Such a methodology holds the promise of altering how scholars, archivists, and research librarians envision the relationship between Black women's unpublished material and the creative output issuing from this body of evidence. Published within a 3-year span, Linden Hills and Mama Day lend themselves to critical reevaluation in relation to the source documentation outlining the ethnographic research, editorial correspondence, and notations Naylor leaves behind in a cleverly self-referential manner that speaks to the author's dual commitment to the craft of fiction writing and the unglamorous work of archival practice. Naylor's second and third novels engage symbolic instances of archival omission or misrepresentation through an artful reinvention of source material in ways that insinuate the need for a methodological approach to Black women's papers, featuring a forceful interaction with documents from the past. An interpretive strategy involving the interrogation of rhetorical or linguistic silence is useful in investigating what was, in terms of preserving a vanished heritage, as well as speculating about what is to come. In this regard, whether it is inscribed in source material or re-inscribed in literary texts, history is never fixed. It is a kaleidoscopic record subject to interpretation and reinterpretation, revision and adjustment, rupture and disruption, in a careful negotiation of the intersection between the work of fiction as a literary artifact and its precursor documentary sources. In fictionalizing the encounter with the archives, Naylor attends to what I refer to as the semiotics of documentary sources, in gesturing toward a radical Black female subjectivity responsive to changing social and cultural realities. Maria Dondero puts it another way when she points out that, in semiotic terms, archiving means re-enunciating and therefore producing something new. In this respect, the archive may also be approached from the point of view of its semiotic performativity. Archiving is, she asserts, in some ways less of an observation of what was and more of a production of what we want to do. One is reminded of the post-structuralist notion of signification, or the deconstructionist concept of trace, in relation to the demands of Black women's archives. Absent things leave traces of their presence, erasing in a Derridian sense the boundaries between what is seen and unseen, and in the case of the archives, what is published and unpublished, written and unwritten. Gayatri Spivak deploys a post-colonial lens in gendering the once silent, invisible subaltern, bringing together gender, race, class, and sexualities in a critique of power structures lending themselves to the marginalization of social groups. It is the task of the feminist translator, or scholar activist in this case, to acknowledge the power dynamics inherent in translation by learning the language of the other, rather than imposing a definition of solidarity and feminism on them. Lyndon Hills instantiates a readerly strategy useful in interrogating source material through symbolic instances of linguistic silence. By doing so, Naylor's second novel lays the foundation for a reconceptualization of established archival methodologies in relation to Black women's creative output. In a reading of encounters with source material, we are compelled to look backward and forward simultaneously, returning eventually to an interpretive space located outside established spatial or textual bounds. Naylor's second novel destabilizes the sequential arrangements underlying an otherwise linear narrative by introducing a range of narrative perspectives centered around a buried history involving bourgeois capitalism and patriarchy. Core themes in contemporary Black feminist thought, work, family, and intersectional oppression emerge from a slavery past with the exploitation of Black women's sexual and Black women's labor and sexual capital. While slavery offers a basis for an appraisal of Black women's domestic lives, social interactions, intellectual endeavors, and artistic expressivity, evidentiary documentation is a locus for theorizing about Black women's post-slavery experiences in a history marked by the evolving subjectivity and voice of the subaltern. Willa Prescott needs speculation about the real Evelyn Cretan after discovering cryptic cookbook entries signaling Evelyn's descent into madness, issues from documents attesting to the known facts of the foremothers' marriage. But the story of Evelyn's clandestine search for a particular catalog of grocery items, the woman's physical appearance, as well as the delivery boy's final visit to the Needed home, constitute both an artful reinvention of the hidden details of source documentation and a critique of a meta-narrative involving Black women's invisibility within domestic or social structures. And as I was preparing for this talk and rereading Gloria Naylor's Linden Hills, with a view to understanding the ways in which Naylor embeds or encodes successive encounters with archival materials, one of the things that stood out in my mind was how difficult it was for me to make a clear-cut distinction between the archival material, the facts that Willa encountered as she took a look at that material in the basement and what she was interjecting into that material in an imaginative way. Naylor very consciously, and I think skillfully, blurs the boundary between Willa's imaginative engagement with source material and the source material itself. The image of Evelyn wearing a veil, a wide-brimmed hat, and long gloves is Willa's conjecture as she conjures the moments of Evelyn's private and public life, lending bodily essence to a woman who was otherwise silent and imperceptible. The question, what drove her, Evelyn, to make that kitchen her whole world, is a catalyst for a fanciful reimagining of the hidden details driving Evelyn to madness and suicide. Evelyn is reanimated by taking on a life apart from the language structures marking her mental and emotional decline, as Willa relies upon Black women's lived experiences in filling in the gaps, punctuating the disjointed diary entries her foremother pens. A dependence upon the conjoined or intersecting perspectives of Lester Tilson and Willie K. Mason not only unsettles an ostensibly chronological narrative of bourgeois patriarchy and heterosexual normativity, it also announces the continuation of race, gender, class, and sexual difference in modern and contemporary Black women's intellectual histories. Naylor ritualizes repeat encounters with the archives through the lexicon or the language of the gaze. Mirrored associations between an assortment of marginalized subjects therefore direct attention to representation within and apart from a dominant historiographic record, leading eventually to an erasure of established linguistic and temporal constructs. As Willa's ungendered double, Willie enjoys a non-hierarchical relationship with female characters, including Laurel Dumont, whose climb up the socioeconomic ladder and eventual suicide dramatize Black women's entrapment within patriarchal and class structures. Naylor discloses that she identifies not so much with Willa as with Laurel, who forgets where home is. Recurring dreams in which Willie has no face implicate him in a transatlantic history involving what Hortense Spillers aptly describes as the systematic elimination of the feminine. The troubling silence and invisibility of the feminine in a historical or cultural sense is resonant with institutional practices leading to the erasure of Black female subjects within formal archival spaces. But if Willie's facelessness associates him with a colonizing history featuring removed identities, Willa seeing her disheveled image mirrored in a cookpot after discovering the documents her foremothers leave behind is a signing moment signaling the potential of Black women's historical record as a locus for a recovery of the long-suppressed feminine. Documents from the past also herald possibilities for a new historical reality featuring a radical Black female subjectivity evolving from a disruption between the signifier and the signified. Through the process of not only reading her foremothers' private records from the vantage point of abasement, but also reimagining women's fragmented lives from the intersectional positionality of a late 20th century Black female lived experience, Willa constructs an embodied feminine persona capable of defying the established limits of a colonizing history as well as a prescriptive narrative and text, which is why Linden Hills ends the way it does, with Willa assuming new life or taking on a life of her own, even independently of Naylor's own aspirations. Whenever Naylor talks about the ending of Linden Hills, she mentioned the fact that she was dissatisfied that Willa chose to go back upstairs and attempt to resume her own life. But there is something about Willa's taking a look at those documents that allows her to recreate herself independent from Naylor's own creative imagination in ways that result in the destruction of the needed home or the needed home at the end of the novel itself. Willie, Putney Wayne's poet in residence, emerges at the novel's apocalyptic end, and y'all know I gotta go to the apocalypse sometime. Might as well do it with the fiery ending of Linden Hills. Willie, Putney Wayne's poet in residence, emerges at the novel's apocalyptic end as curator of a narrative art that is speculative in nature, one evolving from the liminal space between the written, extant, or official history of Linden Hills and the subterranean modes of expressivity marking the lives of the needied wives. Naylor situates the perceptive young poet as a foil to Daniel Braithwaite, an internationally renowned scholar who writes a 12-volume history of the community. Braithwaite prides himself on the voluminous documentation serving as the basis for his work. Despite claims of rendering the whole story, the college-educated historian fails to acknowledge an underground record of successive generations of Black women or the working class. He also falls short of exercising what Michelle Caswell and Marika Seifor refer to as the radical empathy essential to a nuanced interpretation of Black women's archival production. Incorporating a feminist ethics approach that centers lived experiences that fall out of the official archival record, Caswell and Seifor identify archivists as caregivers whose responsibilities are not primarily bound to records, but to records creators, subjects, users, and communities through a web of mutual effective responsibility. Naylor, who documents her ambivalent relationship with Yale's institutional culture in writing her second novel, labels Braithwaite as the worst type of academic you could have, someone who could go through life sapping knowledge. Willie's assertion that history is a written photograph foregrounds the need for an innovative approach to Black women's archival production based in memory work and experiential knowledge more so than in a strictly academic method. Naylor frames literary encounters with the archives to underscore the reader's role in interpreting a history that is as lively as the social and cultural context out of which that record develops. As Clodier points out, given the lack of institutions dedicated to the Black experience, the novel became an alternative site of historical preservation, a means to ensure both individual legacy and group survival. Such archivism manifests in the work of these authors through evolving life cycles, as he puts it, where documents undergo repurposing, revision, insertion, falsification, transformation, and fictionalization, sometimes across decades. Rereading Naylor's second novel against archival record sheds light on Linden Hills's complex relation to Black class structures, gentrification, issues surrounding authorship on the part of the Black creative artist, Black women's intellectual histories, global constructions of sisterhood, and the evolution of a 20th century feminist consciousness. Narrative action in Mama Day occurs in a space of linguistic indeterminacy, refigured by Willow Springs' location outside fixed geographic bounds and the novel's animation apart from conventional temporality. That Sapphira Wade don't live in the part of our memory we can use to form words situates her beyond the discrete language structures embedded in the bill of sale announcing Wade's purported ownership and the novel as a work of historical fiction. Sapphira, who owes her existence to a range of antecedent sources, is much more than just an ancestral figure. She offers a discursive connection between the historical records Naylor consulted and the author's fictionalization of that past in relation to Black women's 19th and 20th century history. Names function as emancipatory devices that liberate fictional characters from the linguistic systems seeking to delimit the race-gendered subject, and we saw that in Linden Hills, especially in the peculiar relationship between Willie and Willa. That the island foremother, Sapphira, that the island foremother's namelessness, along with her decision to answer to the name Sapphira, points to Naylor's efforts to release Willow Springs' maternal ancestor from the unreliable significations circumscribing Black womanhood in a New World setting, while paving the way for a radical Black female subjectivity that elides or avoids established linguistic constructions. Silences, omissions, or ambiguities associated with primary source material offer a richly evocative starting point for the investigative work useful in an interrogation of the documents announcing Sapphira's performative self. Like Linden Hills, Mama Day exemplifies what Hartman fittingly describes as creative fabulation, a style of creative semi-nonfiction that attempts to bring the suppressed voices of the past to the surface by means of hard research and scattered facts. Varied interpretations of Sapphira summon the viability of interpretive strategies based in reader response. She is, in a communal folk imagination, satin black, biscuit cream, and red as Georgia Clay, at the same time, no less, depending on which of us takes a mind to her. Willow Springs' ancestor resists field or domestic labor, operating outside the two worlds of work ascribed to Black female slaves. Conjure allows her to undermine the power dynamic inherent in a slaveholding aristocracy. Wade owns the expansive 19th century mansion, but the garden signifies Sapphira's connection with generations of artist-creators in a subversion of the domestic space as a site of patriarchal domination. Mama Day extends the conversation on historical papers as a locus for fundamentally altered social constructions through an inscription of repeat encounters with archival record. Inferences of the terms of Wade's alleged purchase of Sapphira as being tender and kind on the bill of sale Mama Day rediscovers at the other place critique notions of ownership with the original bill of sale that's included at the beginning of the book in ways that undermine the power dynamics in Wade's marriage to Sapphira and rigidly stratified race, gender, and class relations broadly, thereby laying the foundation for a new social and narrative space located outside the boundaries of colonial and neo-colonial rule. In her anticipation of a world marked by an assortment of social arrangements, a space characterized by reciprocity and mutuality, Naylor uses recurrent encounters with historical papers to construct a meta-history of transformed communal associations that challenges the parameters of existing race and gender interactions. Legend and lore surrounding Sapphira's life underscore the folly of attempts to possess, contain, or delimit the Black subject. Wade is no more successful at owning Sapphira than Ruby is at controlling the philandering Junior Lee. That Sapphira births, names, and mothers her 7 sons contradicts a historiographic record that would render Black women passive in the face of a slaveholding aristocracy. Nat Turner faces hanging, a fate that often befell Black insurrectionists. Yet, like the wily trickster of folklore fame, Sapphira escapes the hangman's noose, laughing in a burst of flames. With its semantic vagueness, the document that Mama Day unearths is a site for a critique of the capitalist underpinnings of 19th century master-slave liaisons and the 20th century marriage between George and Coco. Coco's undisclosed illness is a consequence of the young woman's immersion in Western culture and the institutions of urban America. But Mama Day's rediscovery of the lost document gestures toward an atemporal history, summoning a gendered past that holds the promise of a transformed future where hierarchical social structures no longer exist. At the novel's end, in a rhetorical play on George's inability to find Willow Springs on his commercialized map, Mama Day is either unable or unwilling to locate a photograph of George among the family's records. I think she has one. She just doesn't want to show it to anybody. That's her prerogative. Coco's husband is not to be imaged, an imperfect medium for recording a race or gendered subjectivity, but reimagined in a recreation of a disjointed past, refigured as a dynamic space of signage, represented by the fluid story of Coco and George. Repeat encounters with source documentation underscore the shifting linguistic grounds of the papers that present themselves throughout the novel, even as the words inscribed on the recovered bill of sale, tender and kind, announced a new relation apart from the fraught domestic association dooming Sapphira Wade's marriage to Bascom. Larry Dohe points out that generally in literature, if archivists are mentioned, they are stereotyped as being elderly and dowdy and with thick glasses. And the older I get, I just don't take kindly to elderly jokes or comments about elderly people. But Larry Dohe says that generally in literature, if archivists are mentioned, they are stereotyped as being elderly and dowdy and with thick glasses. He goes on to say, one thing I do love about this idea of an archivist being in the book is that it gives us a chance to show the potential of the archives, the contents of the archives, and how they can be used by a writer or filmmaker. But Naylor not only includes archival moments in her novels, I argue, she encodes archival encounters into the linguistic structure of her fictional works in ways that critique an approach to the archives that would divorce historical papers from the knowledge practices they embody or the literary texts they inform. She calls attention to the constructedness of literary accounts of the archives and offers a methodology useful in investigating archival material in relation to Black women's lived experiences. This symposium aims to enhance scholarly interest in and interaction with Naylor's published and unpublished material through a series of engagements with her work. We pay homage to the award-winning author in framing new avenues of critical intervention in Naylor scholarship, archival studies, digital humanities, and Black women's literary and expressive culture. Scholars have already begun the exciting work of mining the archives in relation to the unfinished novel, Sapphira Wade, a 2-volume edited collection of original critical essays devoted to a scholarly investigation of the intersection or interface between Naylor's archival material and her creative output is under advanced contract with the University Press. And we are also, very thankfully, the recipients, proud recipients of a 2021-2022 National Endowment for the Humanities Collaborative Grant. And somebody ought to say amen. What remains is an amplification of efforts at expanding broad access to Naylor's published and unpublished work by presenting this material in varied formats: images, videos, scholarly articles, informal blog posts, and performances. And we have seen much of that over the last couple of days. We must also pursue non-hierarchical collaborative projects that partner with communities and institutions both inside and outside higher education. In accomplishing these broad aims, we acknowledge other archival ventures. Miriam McGraham's project on the history of Black writing, for instance, examines the boundary between race and the digital humanities, archival research, and grant writing. Gabrielle Dudley's curation and exhibitions on Black women writers is another important project. Penn State is home to the Center for Black Digital Research with the award-winning Colored Conventions Project, Douglas Day, and the Black Women's Organizing Archive. And Kimberly Springer's African American Women's Writings in the Archives is essential work in Black feminist digital archives and oral histories. Articulating a Black feminist methodology for archival work demands attention to knowledge bases emanating from folk epistemologies that privilege alternative ways of knowing, of seeing, and being seen. Such knowledge exists at once both within and outside formal institutional structures or the academy, and this practice is linked inextricably with vernacular culture and storytelling tropes. Recent projects in digital humanities endeavor to reach underserved communities and cross geographic and institutional boundaries. Black women's knowledge production counters neo-colonialism by challenging systems of oppression geared toward the marginalization of Black women and their artistic expressivity. It is incumbent upon 21st century scholars to address the institutional biases contributing to the invisibility of Black women in the archives and acknowledge the informal spaces, the basements, giving rise to Black women's archival production. One need look no further than Naylor's award-winning narrative project and her own archival sensibilities for an enabling methodology in charting new directions for Black women's 21st century archival studies and practice. Through our multiple undertakings, we position ourselves in an unmapped space that resists dialectical coding and geographic delineation, a place situated between the edge of the world and infinite possibility, like the magically real Bailey's Cafe. As scholars, researchers, teachers, and fans, we must avoid the static positionality of Reema's Boy, George Andrews, and certainly Daniel Braithwaite, and really listen. Our multi-institutional, interdisciplinary, and transgenerational projects model good practices, not the best practices, but good practices, for a reappraisal of Naylor, who mentioned in my personal interview that she wants to be remembered as a good storyteller, one who mastered her craft and maintained a fidelity to the lives of subjects often excluded from published record. Thank you.